Let's take a look at a more complex graph. In this graph, we see the United States poverty line and poverty rate between 2010 and 2016. We are graphing two different variables on two completely different scales. You'll see the bar graph represents the poverty rate, and the blue line represents the poverty line. We have on the left side the vertical axis in figures of absolute dollars, and on the right side, you'll see percentages. You'll also see the horizontal axis has years. So how do we read that? First, the most complicated thing we need to do is figure out which vertical axis scale goes with which. One goes with the bar graph, the other goes with the line graph. So to understand that, we need to understand the difference between the poverty line and the poverty rate. The poverty rate is, I'll start with the poverty line. The poverty line is the annual income beneath which a family is considered in poverty. Now, if you look up the poverty line, there's going to be multiple poverty lines depending on the size of the family in the household. This data comes from single one-person households. So these are for single folks. So the line tells you in this graph, for a single person living on their own, the income beneath which they are considered in poverty. Now, the poverty rate is the percentage of the US population, which can also be segmented by the size of the household, that is actually underneath the poverty line. So in this case, we continue to focus on households with one person, single adults living on their own. And so the red bars tell you how many single adults living on their own, what percentage of that population is below the poverty line each year. So now that we know what the poverty line and the poverty rate are and how they're different, we can think about which axis goes with which part of the graph. And the important thing here is units. The poverty line is a dollar amount. It's an annual income. So that means the axis on the left, the vertical axis on the left, gives us information for the poverty line. The poverty rate is a percentage, it's a portion. That means the vertical axis on the right side gives us the values for the poverty rate. And collectively, this helps us to make sense of the entire graph. Now, why would somebody put these two items in the graph together? Because the reason is one might want to compare how the poverty rate changes as the poverty line changes. If the poverty line goes up while the poverty rate goes down, that's actually good economic news. Because think about it, when the poverty line goes up and increases, that means it's easier to be considered in poverty. But if a smaller proportion of the population is actually in poverty, that means we've made it easier, but the portion that fit that is smaller. So a larger portion of the population is above an even higher line than the line from before. Whereas on the flip side, if the line goes down while the rate goes up, that's not good. That's bad economic news, right? For the exact opposite reason. So in this case, what we're seeing is now poverty lines are generally going to go up because of inflation. But what we're seeing is in this graph, as the poverty line goes up, the poverty rate goes down. So this appears to be good news. However, don't take that completely at face value, because you should ask, what other reasons might the poverty rate be decreasing? Remember I told you that we restricted to single individuals, adults living on their own? Well, what if between the years 2014 and 2016, a large portion of single adults got married? Well, that may explain why there's a lower percentage, but remember, the percentage is relative to the whole of the number of the entire number of single adults living on their own. So even if that pie shrunk, the percentage is relative to the size of the pie. So that would not actually explain it. But it's a good question to ask and to think about. And that's the point I want to raise, is to think about these kinds of reasons. What other variables, what else might be going on outside of what we can squeeze into a little two-dimensional graph? And these complex graphs attempt to address those kinds of questions, but there's no way to eliminate all of them. Human life is complicated. In the next video, we're going to conclude this section by talking about some ethical considerations when it comes to graphs. You might notice that the graph on the left side and the right side, the axes on the left side and the right side do not go down to 0. That's a problem. And we'll talk about that in the next video.